Located in bustling Detroit, Michigan, the birthplace of the American automotive industry, Timothy Barnes built an empire. As a magnate, Timothy owned a colossal fortune and unparalleled influence. However, amidst wealth and power, his true treasure had always been his family, alongside his charismatic wife, Elsa, and their three beloved children, Brendan, Daphne, and Craig. Brendan, the eldest at 15, was inspired by the bright lights of the city and the gears of the engines. He was a rebel with the soul of a dreamer. His eyes shone with the intensity of a young man determined to change the world. Daphne, the only girl, was 10 years old and the shining star of the Barnes family. Her golden hair contrasted with the steel skyscrapers of Detroit, and her smile charmed everyone, filling her parents with pride and joy. Craig, at just 8 years old, was a younger version of his siblings. As dreamy as Brendan and as charming as Daphne, he carried an insatiable curiosity and the innocence of his tender age. The Barnes' life was joyful and filled with happiness until the day a tragedy took Elsa away. Like an abrupt storm, Elsa's death cast a somber silence over the Barnes home, turning the vibrant atmosphere into a painful stillness. However, the pain of grief served as a propeller for Timothy. He threw himself into work with redoubled effort, taking on the dual role of a tireless CEO and the sole caretaker of his three children. He worked to exhaustion to ensure an even brighter future for his children, a future Elsa would have wished for them. In his office, surrounded by car projects and family photographs, Timothy stood in front of the picture of Elsa and the children. A mix of smiles and pain appeared on his face as he whispered to Elsa's smiling image, "You should be here, but I promise you, I will take care of them. I will give them everything they need, even without you." With that silent oath echoing in the emptiness of his office, Timothy returned to work, his purpose now stronger than ever. Once aligned with the frenetic flow of time, the city of Detroit watched indifferently as 15 long years passed since Elsa Barnes' tragic departure. Timothy Barnes, the titan of the automotive industry, immersed himself so deeply in his professional responsibilities that he almost forgot the other part of his life, his family. The rooms of his mansion echoed not with laughter or family discussions, but with the sound of silence interrupted only by the delicate footsteps of Dahlia, the housekeeper. Sweet and kind Dahlia, with her eternal patience and love, did her best to take on the responsibility of caring for Timothy's children. Her constant presence was a beacon of warmth and comfort in the home that had grown cold with the absence of a loving mother and a father consumed by work. However, despite Dahlia's best efforts, she couldn't fully replace the mother the Barnes children had lost or fill the void left by a father who had become a shadow in his own house. Brendan, Daphne, and Craig, now grown men and women, longed for the guidance and presence of their parents. They found refuge in the wealth accumulated by their father, getting lost in a whirlwind of extravagance. Expensive jewelry, luxurious cars, exotic vacations, nothing was too much for the Barnes heirs. They spent without thinking, as if money could appease the pain of their mother's absence and their father's alienation. The Barnes fortune, once seemingly inexhaustible, now began to show signs of strain. But the three young Barnes didn't notice. They were lost in a world where material pleasures were a poor substitute for the love and attention they desperately needed. Meanwhile, Timothy, blind to his children's reality, continued to immerse himself in his work, oblivious to the impending decline of his fortune and his children's happiness. Brendan Barnes, now a grown man, was a portrait of wasted talent in a wandering life. He had already crossed the gates of 7 different universities, each promising a fresh start. However, none of these educational institutions could grant him the coveted diploma that would put him on par with his distinguished father. His days were filled not by a strict academic schedule, but by the relentless and chaotic rhythm of his wayward lifestyle. The sunrise found Brendan still wrapped in dreams, undisturbed by the constant flow of activity in the city around Detroit. His day began late, when the sun was already high in the sky, and rarely involved a job or any form of productive work. Brendan's mark on each of these 7 universities was not one of academic achievements or social contributions, but rather a trail of transgressions and problematic behaviors. Instead of diligent studies, Brendan's university tenure was filled with incidents that brought him to the brink of expulsion, and ultimately beyond it. He was a man known for his impetuous temper, often leading him into fights. Vandalism was also a common feature of his rebellious behavior. The clean walls and quiet hallways of prestigious universities were at times the stage for his nocturnal adventures, resulting in property damage and disruptions. But the most serious problem, and the one that most frequently sowed his downfall, was drug use. His dangerous flirtation with illicit substances not only tarnished his name and reputation but also repeatedly pulled him out of academic corridors. Brendan, Timothy Barnes' firstborn, instead of following in his father's footsteps, was getting lost in a labyrinth of deviations, never finding his true path. Daphne Barnes, the middle daughter, was a figure that brought life to the stereotype of a spoiled young woman of high society. Her world revolved around a continuous cycle of shopping, partying, and self-indulgence. Daphne lived a shallow and self-centered existence, enclosed in a golden bubble of privileges that were rarely disturbed by the reality of the outside world. With a purse always hanging from one arm and a credit card in the other hand, Daphne got lost among shelves full of trendy clothes, sparkling jewelry, and the latest word in accessories. Consumption was her passion, her vice, the spark that lit up her light blue eyes. Kindness and humility were attributes that Daphne struggled to demonstrate. She was known for her ruthless attitude towards those she considered inferior, treating employees and staff with disdain and disrespect. Dahlia, she would frequently call, her shrill voice echoing through the halls of the Barnes mansion. "Where is my new Gucci bag? And my cell phone? I need to call Alejandro." Speaking of Alejandro Guzman, he was the current object of her affection. Guzman was a smooth and charming man, with a Spanish accent that gave him an exotic air. He proclaimed to be a millionaire, hailing from a distinguished lineage of a wealthy Spanish family. However, Timothy Barnes, always vigilant and suspicious, had his doubts about Guzman's character. One day, during a family dinner, he broached the subject. "Daphne," he began, the tone of his voice suggesting a serious conversation. "I know you really like Alejandro, but it's important to get to know someone well before getting too involved. There's something about him that doesn't sit right with me." But Daphne, lost in her own reality, often didn't take her father's concerns seriously. She was a dazzled moth, flying closer and closer to the flames, unaware of the danger that awaited her. Craig Barnes, the youngest of the Barnes siblings, was an impulsive and inconsistent spirit with a touch of youthful idealism. Initially, he was enchanted by the majesty of his father's automotive empire, showing an initial interest that had sparked a glimmer of hope in Timothy Barnes' heart. But as he grew older, Craig decided he wanted to carve out his own legacy. Every month, Craig would approach his father with a new business idea, a new dream to pursue. "Dad," he would begin, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm, "I have a plan for a tech startup. Or maybe a themed restaurant. Or perhaps a design studio." The problem, however, was that while his ideas were many and varied, Craig was highly irresponsible and impulsive. Moreover, many of his business proposals were downright absurd, far-fetched plans without a basis in research or real market knowledge. His lack of focus and clear vision seemed to doom him to failure. It didn't help that Craig had a penchant for using investment funds to finance his own extravagant lifestyle. Instead of channeling the money towards developing his business ideas, Craig directed it towards luxurious vacations, extravagant parties, and various indulgences. "You know, Dad," he would casually say, a mischievous smile on his face, "I really needed that trip to Ibiza. You know, to clear my head and all." And so, Craig's ventures often ended in the same way, failure after failure, with little to show except a series of debts and a trail of shattered dreams. But despite it all, he always returned, with a new plan in his eyes and a new request for funding on the tip of his tongue. Desperation threatened to consume Timothy Barnes. His face, once marked by determination and focus, now appeared twilight and gloomy, with worry lines more pronounced than ever. He felt lost in a sea of confusion and disillusionment, unable to understand how his beloved children could be sinking so deeply. By Timothy's side, ever present, was his closest friend and confidant, Bobby Dixon. Dixon was Timothy's right-hand man in the automotive industry, a trusted man whose advice Timothy deeply valued. Despite Dixon's often harsh words, Timothy knew that each observation came from a place of love and concern. "Barnes," Dixon would start, with his firm and balanced voice, "you have to be tougher on these young ones. They need to learn that life is not a bed of roses. The world out there is a harsh place, and they need to be ready to face it." But Timothy was conflicted. He felt torn between his intuition as a father and the words of his trusted friend. Deep down, Timothy believed that the vast fortune he had amassed should be used to alleviate his children's pain, to compensate for the immeasurable void left by their mother's absence. "I know, Bobby," he would reply with a heavy sigh, looking at the pictures of his children on his desk, "but they have already lost so much. If my money can provide some relief, some comfort, isn't that what a father should do?" Bobby's face softened with his friend's raw honesty, but the concern never completely disappeared. Timothy, a king in the business world, felt like a pawn in his own home, desperately trying to balance his friend's advice with his love for his children. The spiral of disorder and decadence reached an unbearable climax on a Monday morning. Timothy Barnes woke from his sleep in his silent bedroom, the morning light filtering through heavy curtains. The calm of the new day was shattered when he discovered the truth about Craig's latest venture. His youngest son had pleaded for a substantial loan, claiming he needed the money for an intensive training program for a new business. But instead, Craig had squandered all the money on a luxurious resort over the weekend. The sense of betrayal Timothy felt upon uncovering this lie was like a punch to the gut. When Craig arrived home, a jovial and carefree expression on his face, Timothy couldn't contain the storm of emotions brewing within him. "Craig," he began, his voice stormy, "what did you do with the money I gave you? You went to the training program, didn't you?" Caught off guard by his father's stern tone, Craig hesitated for a moment before responding, "Yes, Dad. It was a great program, I learned a lot." "Don't lie to me, Craig," Timothy interrupted, his voice resounding through the walls of the room. "I know everything. You went to a resort, squandering the money I gave you to invest in your future." The silence that followed was deafening. Craig looked at his father, surprised and ashamed. The ensuing argument was tumultuous and filled with accusations. Timothy's harsh words echoed through the mansion, a painful reminder of Craig's betrayal and the chasm that now opened between father and son. In the heart of the afternoon, as the sun blazed fiercely over the landscape of Detroit, Timothy Barnes was struck by another crisis. Brendan, his eldest son and perpetually troublesome, had once again crossed the line of common sense. But this time, things had been taken to a dangerous extreme. The news came in the form of a distressed phone call from the dean of the university where Brendan was studying. "Timothy, I can't believe I have to say this." The dean's voice was low, shaken, a storm of disappointment and frustration raging in the background. Brendan, in a moment of youthful recklessness fueled by alcohol, had stolen the dean's car. Not only that, he had driven under the influence, covering miles of road at high speed, a recklessness that could have ended in tragedy. To further complicate matters, it was discovered that Brendan was having an affair with the dean's daughter and had involved the innocent young woman in his dangerous escapades. A crucial detail was that the dean was a personal friend of Timothy's and had accepted Brendan into the university after a personal plea from Timothy, as no other institution wanted to admit Brendan due to his troubled history. "How could you?" The dean questioned Timothy, his voice trembling with anger and disappointment. "I trusted you, Timothy. I trusted your son. And this is how you repay me." Timothy, stunned by his friend's words, felt a bitter mix of shame, disgust, and despair settle in his heart. The day, which had already begun with an unwanted twist, was proving to be an endless nightmare. And at its center was the reckless behavior of his children, who seemed determined to burn through life at the fastest and most dangerous flame possible. Just when Timothy Barnes thought he had endured an unbearable share of problems for a single day, he was confronted with a new wave of chaos. In the dead of the night, upon returning home, he found his mansion transformed into a raucous party scene. As he entered through the wrought iron gates, Timothy was greeted by the sight of shimmering lights, loud music, and the laughter of countless guests spilling across his meticulously manicured gardens. Luxury cars were parked everywhere, giving his residence the appearance of a nightclub. With a heavy heart, he entered the mansion, where the scene was even more chaotic. Staff members ran back and forth, serving drinks and food, while guests danced and reveled, oblivious to the turmoil the Barnes family was going through. At the epicenter of all this extravagance was his daughter, Daphne, laughing and sparkling in an expensive dress. Beside her stood Alejandro Guzman, wearing a triumphant smile. Timothy's heart sank as he understood the situation. It was an engagement party. And Daphne hadn't thought twice about organizing it, despite knowing Timothy's disapproval of Alejandro. "Daphne!" he called out, his voice rising above the booming music. The girl turned around, her face lit up by a bright smile, oblivious to the storm forming on her father's face. "Dad! I'm so glad you made it in time. Alejandro and I have decided to make our engagement official." Timothy felt as if the ground was opening beneath his feet. Daphne knew full well that he did not bless this relationship, at least until he could learn the true origin of Alejandro. But his daughter had completely disregarded his feelings and concerns, and instead, threw a surprise engagement party for herself in their own home. With each step his children took, Timothy felt the distance between them grow, making reconciliation increasingly difficult. At the end of an agonizing day, Timothy Barnes was utterly exhausted. His energy had drained, his emotions were in tatters, and he felt a deep sadness penetrate his soul. His mansion, once a symbol of success and security, now felt more like a stage for a destructive drama. Amidst the silence that followed the tumultuous party, he sat in the living room and his eyes fixated on a painting hanging on the wall. It was a depiction of the family from a simpler time, a time when Elsa was still alive. Timothy, Elsa, and their 3 children, all smiling carefree, ignorant of the adversities that the future held for them. Tears welled up in his eyes as he gazed at Elsa, beautiful and radiant as she had always been. And as he saw the reflection of his children when they were still young and innocent, he allowed the tears to stream down his aged and weary face. At that moment, the door opened and Dahlia, the housekeeper who had become the motherly figure in Elsa's absence, entered the room. Bobby Dixon, his longtime friend and trusted advisor, stood right behind her. Both of them observed Timothy's downtrodden figure, and without a word, they approached and embraced the devastated man. After a shared moment of silence, Bobby finally spoke, his voice gentle yet firm. "Tim, your children need to learn a lesson." Timothy's determination shone in his eyes. He had decided it was time to change things. It was time to become the father his children truly needed. Timothy, still lost in his memories and sorrows, nodded slowly. "I know," he admitted in a soft voice. "I've been neglectful. I've been too indulgent with them, always thinking that my money would make up for the void I left and the loss of Elsa. But I was wrong. Timothy's resolve now burned brightly. He had made up his mind that it was time to make a change. It was time to become the father his children truly needed. And what would you do if you were in Timothy's place? How would you handle this situation? Share your ideas in the comments. On a Tuesday, nearing the middle of the month, the sun peeked through the large window of the house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, illuminating Timothy Barnes' serious face. It was an unusual scene. The patriarch of the Barnes family, known for his almost obsessive dedication to work, was at home during business hours. At that precise moment, the mansion's door swung open abruptly. Brendan, Daphne, and Craig burst in, each wearing a mix of confusion and desperation on their faces. They waved their now useless credit cards while trying to make sense of what had happened. Timothy, despite his calm appearance, felt a knot in his stomach as he saw the expressions on their faces. He took a deep breath and began to explain. "I need all of you to calm down and listen carefully. Someone within our company has betrayed us," he said with a seriousness that instantly silenced his children. "There is a corruption scheme happening behind our backs. The police are now investigating the company, and all our assets have been frozen." He paused, observing the confusion and fear settling on his children's faces. "And there's more. We have all been implicated in this scheme. They are trying to bring us down." Daphne was the first to speak. What are we going to do?" "For now," Timothy said, "we need to flee. We need to go into hiding until our lawyers can resolve this situation and prove our innocence." Timothy Barnes' children, who had spent their entire lives knowing only luxury and security, now found themselves at the center of a scandal that could destroy everything they had. In that moment, the silence in the room was shattered by the distant but growing sound of police sirens. Timothy's children, who had appeared skeptical of their father's words until then, widened their eyes at the sudden reality. Fear filled the air as the sirens grew closer and closer. The deafening sound of sirens filled the air when suddenly the front door was kicked open. Uniformed police officers, guns drawn, stormed into the mansion's entrance hall. A sharp and authoritative order echoed through the house, "Everyone on the ground, now." With adrenaline pumping through their veins, Timothy took his children by the arms and led them through the vast and ornate hallways of their home toward the back door. With their hearts pounding in their chests, they ran toward a car parked at the rear of the property. Timothy's children, Brendan, Daphne, and Craig, were terrified. Their faces, pale with fear, were almost unrecognizable. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even begin to imagine, was that this was all a meticulously planned ruse by their father. Those weren't real police officers. There was no investigation. Timothy Barnes had orchestrated the entire drama to teach his children a life lesson that he believed they needed to learn. After a long journey, crossing the vast American continent, they arrived at a small spot on the map called Bowbells, North Dakota. There, immersed in a sea of wheat fields, was the place where Timothy Barnes had spent his childhood until the age of 15. The house was a modest wooden structure, faded by time and weathered, surrounded by a dirt yard. The porch boards creaked with each step, and the wind whispered through the gaps in the windows and doors. It felt like an empty shell of a bygone era, a ghost of memories. "I can't believe this," Daphne exclaimed, wrinkling her nose as she looked around. "This can't be serious." "I refuse to stay here," declared Brendan, a look of pure disdain on his face. Craig just looked on silently, seeming more lost than his siblings. But Timothy remained steadfast. "For now, this is where we'll stay," he said. "And furthermore, since all our accounts are frozen, all of you will have to work. We need money to sustain this house." Protests were immediate and deafening, but there was no other alternative. Timothy watched his children's revolt with a resolute expression. He knew this was the only way to teach them about the reality of life. Amidst the small cluster of local establishments in Bowbells, Daphne managed to find a job at Mama's Home Cookin', a family comfort restaurant that was a cornerstone of the community. It was a humble building with walls painted in a faded, gentle blue, its windows brightening the interior with inviting golden sunlight. Despite the welcoming appearance of the place, the work proved to be a daily battle for Daphne. Endless hours on her feet, moving between tables with heavy trays, enduring the stifling heat of the kitchen and the constant smell of frying. Her feet throbbed in tight shoes, her hands dry and cracked from constant dishwashing. However, what consumed her the most were the customers. Unknown faces, harsh voices, and looks of disdain. Every harsh word and scornful glance heightened the humiliation she felt. They mocked her lack of skill, complained about her mistakes, and laughed at her expense. "You're new here, aren't you?" an arrogant customer once taunted after Daphne spilled a glass of water on the table. "You need to learn to move more gracefully, dear." In those moments, Daphne found herself on the verge of tears, a bitter taste of despair in her mouth. But even so, she forced herself to swallow her pride and continue, because there was no other alternative. She was learning, in the harshest way, the importance of patience, humility, and taking responsibility. And though it was a constant struggle, Daphne was determined to face it. In the dusty heart of tiny Bowbells, the structure of a building under construction rose against the clear blue sky. It was here that Craig found a job. However, it didn't take long for him to realize that he wasn't prepared for the hardships of manual labor. The older workers, accustomed to years of toil under the hot sun, laughed as they saw him sweating profusely, his delicate hands turning red and blistered as he struggled with cement and steel. "You better get used to it, kid," chuckled one worker, a man with a wrinkled face and a hoarse voice, as Craig panted under the weight of a pile of bricks. However, even amidst the mockery and backbreaking work, Craig managed to find a glimmer of hope. Among the laborers was Sam, an older guy with a special twinkle in his eyes and a shared love for technology. Sam, despite his dirty and unkempt appearance, possessed a sharp intellect and surprising knowledge of computer hardware. "You know," said Sam one day, as they shared a lunch break under the shade of a nearby crane, "we could do something more with our skills. There are plenty of computers out there in need of repairs. Maybe we can start something together." And that's how the idea emerged, to open a computer repair shop. Craig found himself facing a new challenge, trying to build a business from scratch with extremely limited resources. Every penny counted. Every step toward establishing his shop was taken with care and caution, and Craig had to quickly learn the importance of valuing every penny, every effort, and every little progress. Learning to balance the shop's finances, deal with customers, do marketing, and, of course, refine his technical skills, Craig was, for the first time, experiencing the true taste of responsibility in hard work. And despite all the obstacles, he was determined to make this business succeed. In the heart of Bowbells, nestled among low-rise buildings weathered by time, a tool store stood out. The owner, a robust man named Pete, had hired Brendan to assist with the daily tasks. But instead of adapting to the new job, Brendan found trouble. In just 1 week, his hot-headed behavior and refusal to conform to work rules culminated in a fight with one of the store's longtime employees, resulting in his dismissal. Frustrated but without options, Brendan went home and told his father, Timothy, about what had happened. Timothy's wrinkled face hardened as he heard the story, but instead of reprimanding his son, he offered him a new perspective. "Brendan," he said, with a calmness that concealed his disappointment, "if you can't handle people, maybe you can learn to handle things. Let's renovate this house together. But I want you to be responsible and committed to it." Brendan, still inflamed from his recent dismissal, wasn't initially excited about the prospect of manual labor. However, with no money and no other options, he found himself with no choice but to accept his father's offer. Over time, as he hammered, nailed, and painted, Brendan began to appreciate the value of hard work. The sweat dripping down his face, the pain in his muscles at the end of each day, and the slow, steady growth of the renovated house started to bring a satisfaction he had never experienced before. He was creating something, transforming the old house into something new and improved, and that sense of accomplishment gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. After several weeks, Brendan looked at the house, the walls now firmly erected and painted, the furniture in place, and felt a deep sense of pride. He had worked hard, and it meant something. The result of his labor was tangible, palpable, and he learned to appreciate that. He was beginning to understand the value of work and responsibility, an important step on his path to maturity. In the blink of an eye, 3 months had passed. Life in Bowbells, North Dakota, was a drastic change compared to the excessive luxuries of Detroit that Brendan, Daphne, and Craig were accustomed to. They traded fancy cars, lavish parties, and extravagant shopping for hard work, simple meals, and peaceful nights. However, this forced change brought an unexpected transformation. The once distant and divided Barnes family was coming together. Every evening, in the modest kitchen of the aging house, the family gathered around the worn wooden table, sharing home-cooked meals and stories of the day. It was a scene of simplicity and authenticity, a stark contrast to the dinners served by servants that characterized their previous life. "How was your day, Daphne?" Timothy asked, looking at his daughter through the soft light of the table lamp. "Well, a customer spilled coffee on me today," she replied, a hint of a bitter smile on her face. "But I think I'm getting better at the job." "And you, Craig?" Timothy turned to his youngest son, observing the sparkle in his eyes as he talked about the computer repair shop he had opened. Timothy's eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness as he heard these stories. He was getting to know his children, truly knowing them, and it made him realize how distant he had been from them all these years. In one of those moments, as he watched his children, he confessed, with a heavy tone in his voice, "I'm sorry, for being so distant. For neglecting you. I should have been more present." In that simple house, in the small town of Bowbells, Timothy was learning a valuable lesson about what truly mattered. And amidst difficulties and challenges, he was finally building a real relationship with his children. On a particularly hot summer day, the tranquility of Bowbells was disrupted by the arrival of an unexpected intruder. The presence of a flashy red sports car, a rare sight in that small town, didn't go unnoticed. Behind the wheel was Alejandro Guzman, the charming but dubious fiancé of Daphne. He pulled up to the modest wooden house, and his arrival sparked an instant reaction. Daphne, surprised and confused, rushed outside to greet him. Timothy, on the other hand, approached more cautiously. "Alejandro," he said, a forced smile on his face. "What are you doing here?" "I came to bring good news, Timothy," Alejandro replied, grinning from ear to ear. "The investigation is over. We are all free." Timothy paled. He had orchestrated this charade to give his children a chance to learn about the real world. Now, Alejandro's discovery could ruin everything. "What?" Daphne asked, looking from Alejandro to her father, her eyes filled with doubt. Alejandro's triumphant look at Timothy suggested an ulterior motive. He had uncovered Timothy's plan and come here ready to reveal the truth. He wanted to secure his marriage to Daphne, and it seemed that nothing, not even Timothy's charade, would stand in his way. In this unexpected twist, Timothy found himself trapped. He couldn't refute Alejandro without risking the revelation of the truth. Thus, the idyllic charade in Bowbells was about to unravel. In a mix of relief and frustration, Timothy's children left the bucolic scene of Bowbells, craving the hustle and bustle of the metropolis they had once despised. Timothy watched their departure with a heavy heart, knowing he was losing, once again, the chance to shape his children into better, more understanding, and grateful individuals. Back in the city, Timothy, with the persistence of a detective, summoned his friend and advisor Bobby. With a determination in his eyes, he instructed Bobby to put his contacts into action. He wanted to know everything about Alejandro Guzman and his family, the money, the alleged fortune, every detail that could validate or unmask the stranger's claims. After 2 long intense weeks, Bobby returned with the findings. Alejandro, according to the report, was an imposter, a skilled con artist who won the hearts of wealthy young women to benefit from their fortunes. The revelation hit Timothy like a bombshell. He called Craig and Brendan, handed them the report, and together they rushed to find Daphne. However, a text message from Daphne's phone interrupted them. She and Alejandro had gone to a remote location, planning an intimate wedding just between themselves, with a larger celebration to follow. Timothy felt the blood drain from his face. Daphne was about to marry Alejandro in a community property agreement. In a frenzy, Timothy, his children, and the police rushed to the location, a picturesque farm where the justice of the peace was about to declare Daphne and Alejandro husband and wife. They interrupted the proceedings and, armed with evidence, exposed Alejandro in front of everyone. As the police brought forth the handcuffs to arrest him, Alejandro turned to face Timothy's 3 children, a wild gleam in his dark brown eyes. His flared nostrils and thin lips told the story of his anger and betrayal. He then unexpectedly deepened his voice, his eyes boiling with the urgency of his revelation. Do you think any of this is real? The investigation? The escape? It's all a setup. A deafening silence fell upon the place, the air becoming heavy with confusion, and the expressions of the 3 siblings quickly shifted from relief to bewilderment. Alejandro seized the shock and continued, his voice resounding against the stone walls of the old farmhouse. Your dear father, he planned it all. He had you working like dogs, living in poverty to teach you a lesson. Daphne's jaw dropped, her eyes wide with disbelief. Craig looked dazed, his eyes scouring Alejandro's face for a lie. Brendan, the most impulsive, gasped as if he had been punched in the gut. This revelation, detonating like a bomb in the middle of the room, stirred a whirlwind of varied emotions within the space: shock, indignation, betrayal, and above all, disbelief. Alejandro's revelation spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of shock among Timothy's 3 children. The ensuing silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Finally, Craig broke the silence. Father, he said, a tone of disbelief in his voice, is it true? Have you been lying to us all this time? His gaze locked onto Timothy, demanding an explanation. Timothy, burdened by the weight of guilt on his shoulders, met Craig's gaze. He sighed, knowing it was time to confront the truth. Yes, he said softly, it's true. I lied to you. The admission hung in the air like a confession, resonating with the force of a blow. The once shocked children transitioned to anger. Accusations flew through the air like poisoned arrows, each one pointing to Timothy's betrayal. Daphne, in a tone so cold it made Timothy's heart freeze, said, so, it was all a play. To teach us a lesson. How could you, Father? Brendan, always the most impulsive, simply let out a roar of frustration and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Timothy watched helplessly as his children, one by one, distanced themselves from him, anger and betrayal reflected in their eyes. He tried to call out to them, to ask for forgiveness, but the words remained stuck in his throat. And then, they were gone, leaving Timothy alone with the consequences of his actions. 2 years later, the passage of time was a harsh reality in Timothy's mansion, where days were filled with an oppressive silence only broken by Dahlia's comforting presence and the occasional whispers of the staff. Timothy's isolation, however, was of his own making, a consequence of his actions that he had accepted with resignation. Nevertheless, every month, Timothy tried to reach out to his children, depositing funds into their accounts in the hope of reconciliation. But like a reflection of his own obstinacy, each payment bounced back, returned without a single touch. On a sunny afternoon, Timothy's solitude was interrupted by Bobby's unexpected arrival. With a smile on his face, Bobby extended his hand in greeting. "Congratulations, Timothy," he said, but the joy in his voice found no echo in Timothy. Timothy responded with a heavy shrug. "There's nothing to celebrate, Bobby," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "My children, they are far away." Bobby, always the pragmatist, was not deterred by the somber atmosphere. "They are far away, yes," he admitted, "but they will never be out of reach. You need to try again, Timothy. Ask for forgiveness." Timothy looked at Bobby, a glimmer of hope igniting in his eyes. Perhaps Bobby was right. Maybe there was still a chance for reconciliation. But above all, maybe it was time for Timothy to take the first step. Driven by the hope of reconciliation, Timothy embarked on a journey to the old family house in the countryside. As he traversed the familiar roads, he contemplated how his children had changed, hoping that time had softened their grievances. Arriving at the house was a sweet surprise. The once dilapidated structure now stood with grace and solidity, framed by a well-kept garden. The scent of fresh paint permeated the air, suggesting recent renovations. Taking a deep breath, Timothy opened the front door. In the center of the room stood his 3 children, engrossed in a deep conversation. Timothy's entry interrupted their words, and the room immediately filled with a deafening silence. All eyes turned to him, expressions ranging from surprise to indignation. Then Craig, always the most explosive, broke the silence. With fury gleaming in his eyes, he asked in a trembling voice of disbelief, "What are you doing here, Father?" The question echoed through the room, putting Timothy in the line of fire of the tumultuous family reunion. Standing in the room, under the intense gaze of his 3 children, Timothy paused, gathering his thoughts. Then, swallowing his pride, he began to speak. "I want to start by apologizing," he said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I made mistakes. Big and small mistakes. That's why I'm here, to admit that to all of you." He looked at the floor, memories flooding him. "Your mother, she would have been the first to tell me that I was wrong. She had a way of seeing things clearly that I always lacked." A brief pause to contain the emotions that threatened to spill over. "I should have been more present for you, instead of hiding behind my work, my wealth. I realize now that, in trying to compensate for my absence with money, I was actually exacerbating the problem." He lifted his gaze, meeting the eyes of each of his children. "I made mistakes while trying to do the right thing, and for that, I apologize. For not being the father you needed, the father you deserved." Silence settled once again in the room, but this time it was a heavy silence, filled with reflections and unspoken thoughts. Timothy stood still, the sincerity of his words hanging in the air, his hope for reconciliation now in the hands of his children. Heavy hearts in the room gave way to overflowing emotion. The tension dissipated like smoke in the wind, replaced by a sense of relief and acceptance. Tears, once of frustration and anger, now streamed from everyone's eyes in a feeling of renewed love and forgiveness. Timothy, dazzled, discovered that his children, despite all the adversities, had flourished in life. Craig, with a remarkable talent for technology, had found a reliable partner, and together they had opened a successful computer store in town. A smile of pride illuminated Timothy's face as Craig narrated his journey. Brendan, who had once been a rebellious soul without a cause, found purpose and passion in the art of woodworking. The young man now owned a renowned furniture factory, producing exquisite pieces that were highly sought after. Timothy, listening to Brendan speak passionately about his craft, felt immeasurable joy. Lastly, Daphne. The girl who had started working as a waitress to make a living had an innate talent for fashion. She learned to sew, and over time, she opened her own clothing brand. Daphne's label was gaining recognition and acclaim in the fashion industry. Timothy, hearing each of his children's journey, felt a deep sense of pride and admiration. Love overflowed in his heart as he realized that, despite all the hardships, his children had thrived, making their own fortune through hard work and determination. It was a new beginning, not just for him, but for the entire family. In that moment, an emotional mirror was erected in the room. Timothy's children reflected on their own actions and how they had reacted to their father's behavior. A light of self-awareness illuminated their faces as they realized the depth of their own shortcomings. "You know, Father," Daphne began, her eyes lowered as she grappled with the newfound understanding, "we were just as selfish as you, maybe even more so." Brendan nodded, his sister's words resonating deeply within him. "It's true. If it weren't for your drastic action, we would have never discovered our true potential. We were living in your shadow, waiting for everything to fall into our laps. We spent so much time resentful," Craig added, his voice soft but firm. "We overlooked the fact that you were trying to teach us a valuable lesson. One that we would have never learned if we had stayed in the life we had." Timothy silently observed as his children faced their own realities. He saw the maturity in their faces, noticed the resolve in their eyes. Amidst apologies and hugs, it became clear that the lesson had been learned, and the relationship between them strengthened in a way that would never have been possible without the challenges they faced together. Emotion filled the room as Timothy, with teary eyes, thanked his children. Although it had caused pain initially, his decision had transformed his once spoiled children into people worth admiring. Daphne, Brendan, and Craig had become better individuals and had found their passions in life, even if they were different from the automotive empire that Timothy had built. "Happy birthday, Dad," Brendan said, breaking the emotional moment. Timothy looked surprised. Dahlia, the kind housekeeper, entered the room holding a homemade birthday cake, her eyes filled with tears. Everyone gathered around the table and sang, "Happy birthday," but Timothy's heart was filled with more than just the joy of his birthday. He was filled with pride for his children and relief that they had finally reconciled. The night ended in celebration, laughter, and shared stories. The house that was once a scene of despair and confrontation was now filled with the love of a united family. As Timothy bid his children goodbye that night, he felt as if a tremendous weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He returned home feeling lighter than he had in years. A month later, Timothy was peacefully found asleep in his bed by housekeeper Dahlia. He had passed away in his sleep, leaving behind a reconciled family and a thriving automotive empire. The news of Timothy's passing was a shock to the children. However, they also took solace in the fact that Timothy had spent his final days knowing that his children had thrived and become good people. Daphne, Brendan, and Craig continued to successfully manage their respective businesses. They also decided to honor their father's legacy by taking over the leadership of the Barnes automotive industry. Together, they led the company to new heights of success, always keeping the memory of their father alive. In the end, Timothy's plan had worked. His children had learned to value money and hard work, to respect themselves and others. They had become the people he always wanted them to be. They were his legacy, proof that he had finally done something right.